When we think about growth management today, we often associate it with reducing urban sprawl, or at least directing that sprawl in ways that minimize how much green space or natural space it consumes. But a lot of the tools and techniques that we associate with growth management today were actually developed to counter density, in effect, to decentralize it. And as we'll come to see shortly, some of those decentralization tactics actually made it easier for us to sprawl. So, we're going to briefly revisit some of the original goals of growth management and then talk a little bit more about some contemporary goals and tactics. So, as I mentioned, some of the initial goals were actually trying to address density. They thought that density was creating some harmful conditions, and that these conditions would go away if density were reduced. So, density was seen as a problem that needed solving, and a range of reformers from different perspectives and walks of life wanted to try to improve conditions by dealing with density. So, if you've taken a course with me, you'll know that I love talking about Ebenezer Howard, who developed the Garden City model as a way of responding to that density. And I want to turn now again to revisit some of his some features of his approach. So, key aspects of his work were about redirecting or rechanneling growth into smaller clusters of people and activity and nodes. So, he was trying to remove density not by getting rid of it completely but by shaping it and moving it to less dense but still somewhat concentrated settlements. So he wanted not just to take people out of central cities like London, he also wanted to bring work to those people. So he was trying to create complete communities, which is more of a contemporary term that we use in planning today, so that they'd be happy to stay in those communities and not go back to the big cities and create that density problem all over again. So he wanted to make sure that moving industries and jobs was part of that solution. And his goal was to create effectively what we see as a nodal dispersal strategy um, to places that were a simple train ride away. Now, just a point to remember that transportation technology really was a key part of Howard's solutions. So at the time he was developing his ideas, steam trains existed and they were used, but they were still a relatively fresh and evolving transportation technology. I mean, you might make a similar comparison to electric cars and electric airplanes today. You know, they clearly existed, but there was still a long way to go to create a full infrastructure to support them, and a lot of refinements were still needed. So Howard was really one of the first people to put together the ideas of giving better housing options in new nodes that were also supported by strong transportation connections via steam train networks. And his diagram that I'll put up here really showed us that sort of hub and spoke model of distributing density. And this type of idea remains important to us today, even though we've certainly moved beyond some of it. So, as somebody who lives in North America today, you may wonder why efforts launched on another continent are so significant to us, and really, you know, how influential and why were they influential here? Just as we see today, great ideas like the 15-minute city were promoted and implemented by somebody else, in that case, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo. Back in the early 1900s, people still loved to take great ideas from other countries and implement them if they made sense. And so in North America, people like Ebenezer Howard and Patrick Geddes influenced folks in Canada like Thomas Adams, or actually, Thomas Adams was a Brit who came to Canada and brought those ideas. And in the US, especially, Lewis Mumford was a big champion of some of these ideas. Now, if you get a chance, you can read a really great discussion of this history, both in the work of Sir Peter Hall, who's a British planning historian and thinker, as well as Canadian scholars Gerald Hodge and Ira Robinson, who wrote a book on planning Canadian regions. And one of the things you'll note from both books is that Ebenezer Howard himself tried to make these ideas a reality, but his ideas really didn't succeed financially. So it took other people to take those ideas forward. Despite his commercial failures, Howard's ideas still impressed people. But A major flu epidemic, in that case the Spanish flu, followed by the First World War, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and the Second World War, made it really difficult to implement these in any significance. So, as a result, it was not until the end of the Second World War that significant plans were developed which would eventually make some of these a reality. Perhaps the largest scale implementation of these ideas happened in London towards the end of the Second World War and in the immediate post war period. Sir Patrick Abercrombie was an architect who led teams of planners and architects to develop Greater London's first master plan, and this plan continues to influence the city to this day. Abercrombie's plan followed some of Howard's ideas for decentralizing people and jobs, not just within London itself, but well beyond the city to other regions not far away. And Abercrombie's plan also followed Patrick Geddes' ideas for starting from a deep base of understanding of the environment, of things worth preserving in a community and as in a region. And as you can see from this diagram, the many experts working on Abercrombie's planning team did extensive research to build this understanding in a London context. But I want to move forward and talk more about what this led to in mid 20th century North America, because these ideas remain a strong anchor for the growth management work we do today. Now, during World War II, many new technologies and management approaches were being developed, and these became quite influential in many segments of post war society. According to British historian Eric Hobsbawm, bureaucratic and logistical techniques which were developed during the war were quickly applied in post war society. And this continued even afterwards. We see examples of this in the large scale American program under President Dwight Eisenhower to build the large scale highway system that remains a backbone of the U.S. transportation network today. You may not know this, but early highways in the 1950s and early 1960s were justified as a defense or military amenity because after World War II ended, the Cold War against the Soviet Union had begun. And the argument was that those highways could not only help average citizens, but they could help mobilize the movement of military equipment and troops, and also double as runways for military aircraft. Highways were crucial for decentralizing people to the suburbs, and in Canada we followed suit, although not as rapidly or as extensively as in the US. In both countries, highways made it possible for large-scale suburbs to develop. While initially linked to ideas for decentralization that came from Ebenezer Howard, who we've just been discussing, the 1950s and 60s era suburbs were not typically accompanied by efforts to decentralize jobs. It was also during this post-war period that some new ideas for concentrating some of the decentralized people were implemented. Swiss-French architect and visionary Le Corbusier designed many beautiful buildings, but he also came up with a radical new idea for managing growth by paying attention to how densities were arranged on individual building sites or plots of land. Le Corbusier sought to move from buildings that occupied most of their sites to arranging buildings so that they clustered density vertically in the form of high-rise buildings. And this led to what I call the towers in the park model of arranging density. Towers in the Park has been very influential in many North American cities, including in several social housing or public housing projects from the 1950s through the 1970s. You can see this legacy today still in many North American cities, including, again, public housing projects. You can see it specifically in suburban Vancouver. For example, the suburbs of Burnaby and Coquitlam have several high-rise projects surrounded by large swaths of green space, which can give a sense of openness in that part of the neighborhood, while also bringing the added benefit of keeping the ground porous for better stormwater retention on-site and groundwater recharge. So far, we've talked about how early growth management efforts tried to respond to density as a problem, as the cause of illness and social problems. We've also seen that in response, early growth management approaches tried to reduce density by being more effective at shaping it and channeling it into nodes that we see here. What we have also seen with early growth management is that transportation, and specifically rail in the beginning, but later on we will talk about other forms of transportation, we certainly saw that Transportation played a really important role in helping to move people from the center city to some of the planned nodes outside of the center. And when we looked at Ebenezer Howard's hub and spoke model, that sort of shows us exactly how the relationship between the center city and the decentralized nodes was expected to look. We've also seen that war helped create technologies and new approaches to problems that then later played a role in post war development, and the highway system is a classic example of this. We have seen that decentralization, again, is really important, but eventually it did go beyond decentralization. And we took a quick look at a micro scale example of shifting the way we accommodate density through the towers in the park model that emerged from Le Corbusier's work. We're going to fast forward now to today, and we'll summarize how those early ideas have evolved into four broad approaches to growth management. These approaches were described by British urban planning historian Stephen Ward, who's based at Oxford University. And the approaches are not mutually exclusive. What this means is that a region might choose to use just one of the approaches, but it might also mix and match a bit. And in practical circumstances, we certainly do see this happening. So the first of these approaches has been labeled infill and centralization approaches. Essentially, growth management approaches in this category no longer see the problem as density. Instead, communities that use these approaches believe the problem is sprawl. And sprawl is a problem because it wastefully consumes natural areas prematurely. And it's also a problem because it fails to make efficient use of infrastructure. For example, sprawl requires extensions of sewer and water lines into areas that have relatively small populations at a time when it would probably make more sense and cost less money to make better use of the existing facilities. Fill and centralization approaches presume that not everywhere in a given region or city has built to its maximum size or height or density. In the 1980s and 1990s, we used to assess the extent to which an infill and centralization approach could be feasible by simply looking at how many parking lots there were at grade, meaning on bare land, in a given core or central node of an area. If there were a lot of these around, then you had a pretty good idea there was still quite a bit of unused development capacity there. Similarly, when you see a lot of low density buildings in areas downtown, especially if those buildings are poorly maintained, then there probably is some unused development capacity. These models then try to assess whether and how much underused capacity there might be in a central place that already has services and amenities. Where there's a lot of this capacity, the models will create incentives for developers to build infill or add higher density buildings in places of underused capacity. Many inner suburbs and metropolitan areas continue to use this infill and centralization approach. They either do this explicitly, meaning they say this is what they're doing, or implicitly, meaning they don't say this is their approach, but it's effectively what they're doing. Infill can take a range of forms. It can include gentle density, or it can include dramatic density increases through things like high-rise developments. And finally, infill developments can seek further improvements like enhancing existing natural resources and natural areas. So, what kinds of incentives do communities use to encourage infill? Sometimes they simply create the zoning that makes it easier for developers to get approvals for their buildings quickly. Other examples might include things like tax breaks for building in central areas with excess capacity, or even creating new civic amenities, new theaters, new recreation centers, or even, and this has been especially popular in some American cities, partnering to attract a large sports stadium. And these incentives effectively mean that some developers are getting better treatment than others. But if the strategy is clear and the goal is truly to manage the city better while protecting the environment, then many cities and regions are willing to have different standards for developers depending on where they want to build. The second type of approach is known as urban containment. When we hear the word containment, we often think of barriers or walls. Containment strategies in a planning context effectively tell developers, don't even think about sprawling beyond the existing city. But instead of literal walls and barriers, communities who use these strategies will try to find softer barriers, like parks or farmland, which could be organized into a green belt or a literal soft container surrounding the developable part of the city. Green belts were part of Ebenezer Howard's Garden City notion, and they were also part of the actual Abercrombie plan for London. In British Columbia, the provincial government created an agricultural land reserve, or ALR for short, in the mid 1970s, and this became a type of greenbelt made up of farmland. The ALR makes it very, very difficult to convert existing farmland in its boundaries to a non farming use. And when it was first introduced, the ALR had very, very strict rules. However, with time, some of those rules became less strict. As one example, a previous administration made it possible to convert farmland into golf courses, since golf courses were still keeping the land mostly free for buildings, and in an emergency, it might be possible to reverse that and convert the golf course back into a farm. So, greenbelts are one type of urban containment approach. Another type uses sewer and water services as a type of soft barrier to extending developing outward. The Capital Regional District, or Metropolitan Victoria in British Columbia, uses this type of approach in its regional growth strategy. This means that anywhere in the capital region, if you own a piece of property outside the urban containment area, you'll be denied access to regional sewer and water services. This means that you might still be able to develop some residential and commercial uses, but at much, much lower densities because you'll need sewage treatment that requires a large septic field if you don't have municipal or regional services. And you'll likely need water from a well, which will again constrain how many people, how many homes, how many employees you can accommodate. Balanced growth approaches keenly recognize that growth can bring good things to communities, especially individual municipalities in a larger metropolitan region. Most cities in North America depend heavily on property taxes for revenue, and most of these also depend on property taxes from businesses because businesses tend to help subsidize the lower tax rates paid by homeowners in residential properties. For this reason, there can be a lot of political pressure in a given region to spread the benefits of those property tax revenues and the businesses who provide them more equally. This can often mean at a regional level, decisions are made to spread growth out to nodes in some outer areas, which are very keen to attract more businesses and people so they can provide better services to those that already live there. So sometimes balanced growth approaches can look a bit like sprawl, at least in the beginning, but eventually they'll result in more nodes spread throughout the region rather than the hub and spoke model that was first envisioned in Ebenezer Howard's day. A lot of transit-oriented development, where growth gets focused on rapid transit nodes like subway and light rail stations, may be strongly influenced by balanced growth approaches. These approaches are politically realistic because they improve the chances that all the politicians in a larger region will agree on a similar strategy when lobbying senior governments, in our case, federal and provincial governments, for new transit and other major transportation investment dollars. Planned decentralization approaches have some things in common with balanced growth approaches to begin with, in that they try to share the benefits of property taxes and growth. Still, these approaches look a lot more like sprawl compared with balanced growth. This is because planned decentralization often can involve building new nodes in areas that are completely or mostly underdeveloped. But the trade off is made to allow this on the basis that densities in the new node will be high right from the beginning. We see some of this happening when a large property is being converted to another use. For example, an old military base is being sold off by a federal government to a major property developer, or when a powerful and influential developer or owner sees some strategic advantage, and this benefits as well the province, state, or federal government. Another example that I'll show here is of a gravel pit that was decommissioned in suburban Victoria and has been converted to a master planned community. As a result, new nodes often will be accompanied by massive investments in new infrastructure and facilities. This means that they'll often get desirable services much sooner than nodes created through balanced growth and other approaches. To review, early growth management saw density as a problem to be solved, and so it focused on decentralizing population to selected nodes outside of city cores or outside of downtown areas. It also acknowledged the role of transportation in helping with growth management. Initially, the results of those early efforts did solve the density problem as it was envisioned back then. But most of the decentralization, especially in North America, did not achieve the goals for more balanced communities that were recommended by Ebenezer Howard. Decentralization was enabled by new highway construction, and because it initially produced low density suburbs without that balance of homes and jobs, decentralization in North America created the new problem of urban sprawl. As a result, new growth management approaches had to address more complex conditions and use another range of growth management tools.